This podcast is brought to you by Mapper Forward's new Patreon community, the Global Coffee Think Tank. Check the show notes or head to patreon.com/mapperforward to find out how you can become a member today. Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Mapper Forward, friends. I am joined once again by the fabulous Brian Gaffney. Welcome back, Brian.
Thanks, Lee.
We are having a conversation about specialty coffee from the consumer's perspective. And today we want to get insight into what specialty coffee industry, what the specialty coffee industry is getting right and wrong about its consumers. What do you think we're getting wrong?
So I'd like to answer that one, Lee, by telling a brief story, and I promise to keep it relatively short. As we talked about a little bit earlier, I work in management consulting, and I was on a project, and at this point, I was a manager in my career, and I was going out to coffee with a partner. So we're talking about, high earner, well-educated, high level of executive interaction and presence, et cetera. And we were on our way to coffee, and I was going to go to an unnamed specialty coffee shop, and then he was going to go to a second wave shop. But we were saying, but that was in his mind and in my mind, we were going to go together. So we're on our way down. And I say to him, why don't you just come with me? I'm going to go to this place. And Lee, this is what he said. Brian, I'd love to, but I went in there one time. And when I was trying to order and figure out what to order, the barista made me feel so stupid that I never want to go back. And Lee, that is, I think, by and large, when we talk about what is specialty coffee getting wrong with consumers, I think the fact that we invite consumers into an experience and then we traumatize them to the point where they feel like they're not qualified to come in and order. I think that's where we're failing. And so the idea that we are judging our consumers, we are admonishing them, we're imposing things upon them that we think that they should know, versus really understanding why they're coming to us. What do they want to get out of this experience? What are they looking for that coffee to do? What do they care to know at this particular point in that experience? And being curious about the consumers, I think that is in large measure what the industry is getting wrong with consumers today.
That's such fabulous insight. I think you hit the nail on the head with that. It goes to the heart of why there's such a barrier between potential consumers into our industry and our industry. They don't feel what we want them to feel. They don't want the experience that we're giving them because we think we're giving them an amazing coffee experience. And what they see is, you make me feel like shit, and I don't want to feel like shit.
So I'm not coming back. And I'd say one of the trends that I noticed, coming back from this trip in Colombia, and I talked about this a little bit in an Instagram post that was, and again, it's some insights you get when you're in the moment, other insights you don't get until you step outside of. But a number of the specialty coffee shops that I visited, Lee, the brewing actually happened either at the bar with the barista right in front of me, or it happened table side, that the barista would literally bring the scale, the kettle, the water, the coffee to the table. And so back to this idea of experienced coffee, the intimacy that creates, right? For me to be curious, ask questions. And the barista was willing to answer any questions that I had, but didn't force a lot of information upon me. But it created a safe space for us to engage around this coffee. And that was what I thought was fascinating. And so when we think about what a specialty or an experiential coffee experience could look like, I think it has to be, how do we reduce the barrier between the barista and the consumer? Back to the idea that we talked about in the last episode about the barista is DJ. The barista is the life of the party, right? Nobody has a good time at the party if the DJ spins bad music. And so the music that the barista or the DJ chooses to play, he or she is taking the pulse of who's at the party. And that, again, is, I think, a skill that baristas have to be trained on, is how do you take the pulse of the person in front of you? If they're coming in for that single, I want that caffeine hit, give them the caffeine hit. If they're kind of curious about the menu, do you have the space in that experience to offer that to them? Or quite frankly, does management just say, look, you have to churn people out, so you don't have time to engage that consumer? So you have to be able to allow for that flexibility of experience to meet consumers where they are and then help them along the way.
And I think that the interesting tightrope to navigate there is that the economics of our industry is broken. And so much like when a waiter comes and serves you your food, or perhaps debones a fish at your table in a restaurant, that level of service, the price tag that comes with that helps you understand the kind of experience that you're having. Whereas I know many a cafe that's gone out of business because they offer tableside brewing, because the economic model that our businesses are built on just doesn't allow for it. And consumers don't have that relationship with coffee enough. Not enough consumers, I guess, have that relationship where they see coffee as a fine dining experience. The wine industry has done a much better job at positioning different wines as being experience wines versus wines that are everyday drinkers.
Right.
What else are we getting right or wrong from the perspective of the consumers? And I'd love you to talk a little bit about the idea of producers, if there's anything that you can see there.
I can, and I can, the producer piece I can talk about all day, because for me, that is part of the driving principle for me.
Yeah.
It's difficult to call something specialty or premium or luxury if we just think about what are some of those synonyms that we can use, right? And if you think about it in any other category, and the thing about which we're speaking, that is specialty or premium or luxury, that there isn't information about it, right? So if I'm going to step into a specialty coffee shop, and even if I'm not sure what specialty means, but if I go in and I get the same amount of information as I do in New York from the Bodega Cafe, right? Which is, he can tell me that it's Colombian, right? It's Colombian coffee that we're serving. And for $1.50 will pour me, right? And almost, if I don't stop him, add a milk and 2 sugars into this Colombian coffee and go. But so when we come to this, right, if I'm going to pay the premium, you have to explain to me what the premium is for. And it can't just be because, right, I can't just feel like, well, I'm paying for the cost of your build out, right, and your rent in this particular neighborhood. And so when you bring the producer into the fold, now I start to understand. And let me be clear, I'm not a fan of the notion of direct trade, right? And again, for me as a consumer, that was one of those romantic notions that I learned about and initially found it really interesting until I started understanding the role that importers and exporters play. And then got it. So this whole notion of direct trade is great for romance, but logistically speaking and practically speaking, it's really not good for the industry. So if you then, right, by bringing the producer in, it helps me understand. And again, let's also, when we bring the producer in, got to get away from the Juan Valdez and Conchita Mule charitable, right? That can't be the
whitewashing,
right? We can't do that. Or the fact that if I'm paying $5 for a cup of coffee, really what you're telling me is the coffee itself is worth $2. The other $3 is charity, right? That's not it either. The fact that, producing coffee is knowledge work, that there's a lot of skill involved, that you have multi-generations of coffee producers who are working to be able to develop this product, that you can plant a tree and it's 3 years until you get that, the first fruit for that harvest. It's that as you go through, on average, it can take 88 kilograms of parchment to be able to get to that 70 kilograms of green coffee. So that, and so the idea that as you go through all of these measures to produce the coffee, maintain the quality, so that by the time it gets to the cafe, you have something that tastes the way you want it to taste. That's the piece that helps me understand why there's a cost associated with that, versus we're taking lower grade coffee, roasting it to the point where you can't taste it. We're adding milk and sugar, and that has a different price point. So by telling the full story, by introducing the value chain at the right times, that is then I think how we start to improve the interaction and the relationship that specialty coffee can have, particularly at the cafe level with its consumers.
The big challenge that our industry has had, and I've been in the industry for 20 years, and for 20 years, well, let's say 15 years, people have been trying to figure out how to have that conversation with the consumer. Because if we're frank about it, consumers like you occupy the very tippy tip of the industry.
Correct.
So the majority of the consumers, look, let's not say the majority of the consumers, but a big, big chunk of consumers would be baffled to know that coffee comes from a tree. And so I think we have much more fundamental education that we need to give to the consumer. But as an industry, as a specialty coffee industry, how do you think that we could be communicating, or how would you like to see us communicate that information to consumers in a way that was fast? Because that's what we hear everybody say, I don't have any time for your education. Just give me my coffee. But also, given the majority of consumers are drinking a milk-based espresso drink or a milk-based coffee with 2 sugars, how much do you think they care about the producer?
I think that many of them don't and won't, right?
Okay.
I think that back to this idea of the jobs to be done, for the jobs to be done framework, and this idea between commercial coffee and specialty coffee. Just because a consumer walks into a specialty coffee cafe, that person is not a specialty coffee consumer. That person is walking into a specialty coffee shop because, and he or she may enjoy the rest of the experience. They may like the look and the feel of it. They may like the order. They may like
the Wi-Fi.
But when it comes to the coffee, exactly. When it comes to the coffee, they're still, and that person is going, and that's the profile of that consumer. So I think it's really identifying, and it's not, because it's not pure segmentation, but it is the ability to say, for those who want to come in and they want to get that cup of coffee, 2 things. One, we have to price the coffee appropriately, right? And this is good. This is another.
Oh, that's a whole other rabbit hole, my friend.
It is, but this is going to be another one of those disruptive things that, because we have never properly paid for coffee, and we've seen it for the geopolitical reasons we've talked about, climate issues, financial security, the increase in costs of fertilizer, etc. Producing coffee is becoming more and more difficult, right? There are other easier ways to earn a living than producing coffee. So
and owning a cafe, just to put that in there.
100%. And so we're going to have to find ways to rejigger the model so that it's worth doing. And then we're going to have to tell the truth to our consumers, right? That's the other, we cannot continue lying to consumers. And by pricing coffee the way that we do, that's really what we're doing. Because at some point we're saying it's okay for you to buy coffee for this price, but on the back end, you're telling baristas you can't afford to pay them more for their hourly wages, and you're telling your green coffee supplier you can't afford to pay more for coffee, right?
Right.
But you now offer 3 to 7 different kinds of plant-based milk alternatives.
Right.
And that's not a knock against the plant-based milk alternative, but what it says is you've made a decision about where you're going to invest money in your operation.
Oh, it's an efficient business and an efficient commerce. And it's a shift in the power dynamic that you and I had been speaking about off air, which we will get to. But there is definitely an imbalance in where our priorities sit on the consuming end as business owners. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Period, full stop. Absolutely.
Okay. Before we get to the next episode, there's something that you mentioned that I do want to just ask you about. You said that the direct trade business model is bad for importers. and exporters. Can you go into that a little bit?
Absolutely. And let me also say, right, because I believe in transparency and full disclosure, and we've talked about Alejandro Cadena and my relationship with Caravella Coffee, right? It's important to note that. But more broadly speaking, the way that direct trade tends to position importers and exporters, it's that they are charging money, right? They're taking money from producers in the transaction without adding value. And that's the myth that must be dispelled. Because when you start to understand the kinds of services that some, not all, but some importers and exporters provide, that enables that roaster to get that high quality coffee, then you start to understand the value that they play in that exchange. And so to tell a consumer, well, because we buy directly from the producer, right, we are therefore, right, it is more responsible, ethically, it's more ethical sourcing, et cetera, but that's not necessarily the case. For example, if you decide to buy 1 year and not buy the next year, what position does that put that producer in? If you're buying directly from that producer, but if we're talking about agronomy services, if we're talking about, how is that producer managing this infestation of Roya, right? How are they, if, they're struggling to figure out how they're handling with the climate crisis and, or, being able to find other buyers for their coffees because a roaster may be off to a new trend. So in the mind of consumers, we've used direct trade to be this romantic notion that it's the best way to buy because we don't understand the role that everyone plays in the value chain.
Right. What I think is also important to highlight is that both of those models are not clearly understood within the industry by the entire supply chain. And I don't think either of them are working as efficiently as they could, nor are they as transparent as they could be. And there are pros and cons for both of those models. And so if anybody listening to this is working on direct trade relationships, I don't want to discourage you from those relationships. What I would prefer is that people understand the responsibility that's involved in working directly with a producer. This is not a one-time thing. If you are going into a relationship with a producer, I think that is fantastic. But think about it the same way as you would going into any, important commerce-related relationship. This is something that should last the test of time if done correctly. There are not enough examples out there of people doing it correctly on either end, to be honest with you. There are emerging examples of importers and exporters that are becoming more involved with increasing the experience at origin. The agendas behind those could sometimes be a little bit dicey, I guess. But that's not to say that there aren't people that are doing direct that aren't doing it well in a way that benefits both. And I want to give an example of that from someone who came on the podcast recently. Check out Mirror Coffee Roasters for anyone that's listening, because Mirror are buying direct, and for one of the coffees that they're offering, they are a very small startup. They are buying direct and they are contributing to improving the experience, I guess the lifestyle of the producer. They recently gave them a few $1,000s to help build a school. So they have made a long-term commitment at the beginning of their relationship, and they demonstrated that by helping to improve the quality of life for the producers on the farm. But that was a direct relationship. Where it becomes what you're speaking of, Brian, and this has happened far too often, is where people say, you know what, it's turning out to be too expensive to continue this relationship, so we're just going to drop this. And it is an expensive endeavor. It is a long-term commitment. And you've got to understand before you go into it, this is a long-term commitment. Build a relationship. Perhaps get together as a group of buyers.
Right.
and make this happen so that you can extend the longevity of this relationship. But point taken there really, really loudly, that importers really do have a valuable role to play in this industry. They get a lot of grief because they are seen as being the money makers in the industry. There's a little bit of a fallacy there that people don't want to understand about that scenario, but we've got so much work in this industry to do about understanding how our supply chain works that it seems to have the same problem as the definition of specialty coffee. We've worked ourselves into a web that we don't quite know how to undo. So
agree. And the other thing, and to add to that, Lee, is the struggle that I have with direct trade is because direct trade is often positioned not as a way to improve that relationship with the producer long-term, et cetera, but it's often positioned as a counter to working with importers and exporters. And I think that as opposed to looking at these as two models that can work, one is used to kind of demonize
David and Goliath.
Exactly. And that for me is the rub.
And demonizing, it's that whole woke culture thing of like, we're just going to do this ourselves because we want to, it's another form of whitewashing.
It is when used improperly, right?
When used improperly,
to your point, when used improperly, it absolutely is.
Yeah.
Right. Again, but back to, I think one of the things we talked about in our very first episode, these are all of the opportunities for maturity in the industry. There's a lot of room to do a lot of really good work.
Yeah.
The question is, how do we, as you talked about it, that body that's responsible for this, how do we amass the group of thinkers and change agents and catalysts who are going to be willing to do this heavy lifting? Because we have to acknowledge this is heavy lifting work, right? This is not going to be, easy, breezy, beautiful.
No. Oh, I like that. Easy, breezy, beautiful. You have been in branding. All right. We have done terribly at trying to keep these episodes short. So as we head into the next episode, we're going to talk about the progress that we would like to see in the industry. I really don't think this is going to be a 10-minute episode, but we're going to try. Thanks again, Brian. This has been a beautifully delicious discussion, and we'll head into the next episode. Peace, love, and peanut butter, everybody. Have an amazing rest of your day. Thanks, friends. If you enjoyed this video, here's what you should check out next. Consider supporting Map It Forward on Patreon and be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell before you leave.